So thanks for showing up early on the second day. I know a lot of people stayed out late last night with in-depth discussions, so we really appreciate it that you're here at 9. We told you last night that we were going to talk about adapting the agenda, and we do have a proposal. So before we get into the plenaries, we're going to have Martin come up and say a few words, and then we'll put the proposal out for what we might do this afternoon.
I was one of those people that was out late last night. I had a lot to say before I left, too, and now I'm trying to remember what that was. So I can just speak for myself, can't speak for National Forest Foundation or Karen or Mary, but I wanted, I'm sorry, is that better? Yeah. Better now? Yeah. So I just wanted to share my personal impressions of the first day and see if there is some agreement. I talked to lots of you last night, so I feel that a lot of you share these same impressions. So I'll just be candid about things. I think, in my opinion, the plenaries were wonderful. I thought they were just better than I ever expected, actually, and I learned quite a bit. And I thought the questions were from the audience, and that discussion was fantastic. And I guess I was a bit surprised at the direction in which the breakouts were headed. We carefully parsed every single word, as you could imagine, of every one of those questions. And we made a conscious decision to ask questions that were pretty vague and open-ended. And we did so because we wanted to not predetermine the discussion and the answers. And we wanted this sophisticated crew to do that. And I guess I assumed that most of the discussion when we were talking about what are the challenges and so on and so forth, that we would have talked a little bit more about budgets, about contracts, about NEPA, about planning, about some more policy-centric sort of things. And at least the breakouts that I was in, it was overwhelming discussion of collaboration. And that's obviously, maybe I think I underestimated the importance of collaboration to all of these initiatives. But at the same time, I guess I'm a bit skeptical that that's all that we can talk about. It seems that that's a good icebreaker, and it's an important part of the dialogue, but now it's time to drill a little bit deeper. I do remember talking to Melanie Parker last night. Vaguely remember. I didn't have a pen with me, so. But Melanie said something that resonated with me, and it was, there is something going on here. That these initiatives, and if you look at those comparison tables, there is something big going on here. That this is a new story. And we're on the cusp of something, we're on the cutting edge. And it would be a real missed opportunity, a blown opportunity, if all we did for 2 days was talk about collaboration and some things we've heard before. Not to say that those are not important, but I think now it's time to get into some of those more difficult policy-focused issues. And that would be my personal preference. And I've cajoled enough of you and others that I think we're going to head in that direction. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. And then Mary's going to tell you how we've responded to your comments and are doing either muddling through or adaptive management. One of the two.
Well, that's whether it's muddling through or adaptive management, it'll be up for you guys to decide. All right. Karen's going to do the introduction of the first panel, the plenary, sorry.
Good morning, everybody. Well, if we could have our panel presenters come down. We have Marnie Criley, Rick Brown, and Jim Walls. All right. So we have this morning Marnie Criley representing the Montana Forest Restoration Committee. And unlike most of the presenters, Marnie is an actual employee of the Montana Forest Restoration Committee. Most of our other presenters have been involved as one of the collaborators, and Marnie actually began her role with the MFRC in that way. We have Rick Brown to my left with he's going to be talking about the Oregon Eastside Forest Restoration, Old Growth Protection and Jobs Act of 2009. Rick works for Defenders of Wildlife. And then we have Jim Walls with Lake County Resources Initiative, who actually is another example of he's the executive director of Lake County Resources Initiative, and he's going to talk about the Lakeview Stewardship Group in Washington. So with that, I will turn it over to the panelists. Thank you. Oh, and yes, Marnie, you're first.
Short person up here. First off, I just want to thank NFF, the Boley Center, and Martin Nye for putting this on and practicing adaptive management today. Much appreciated. And I also want to give a special thanks to NFF because they were one of the conveners of the Montana Forest Restoration Committee, and Mary Mitzos actually continues to be a member of that committee. So thank you, NFF. I also want to give you guys a little bit of a warning. My husband, Mark, has a French student as an intern this summer. And Mark and I are noticing that we had been talking, even when he's not around, we had been talking slowly, loudly, with very simple words. So hopefully I will not do that this morning. Or maybe I should, yeah. All right, so what I want to do is kind of go through the questions that we were sort of asked to go through in this presentation. And then if I have a little time left over, maybe talk about some of the successes and challenges that we have experienced kind of using the process that we have used, which is a bit more of a traditional collaborative effort working within the Forest Services process. So the Montana Forest Restoration Committee was formed, I think, kind of out of some previous collaborative efforts in western Montana, some conversations that in particular the Lolo National Forest had been having with conservation groups, and kind of starting to build some conversation, some agreement, maybe not quite building trust yet, but we'd reached a point where there was a lot of agreement that we wanted to see projects happen on the ground, ecologically sound projects that would provide jobs to local folks, and that would reduce appeals and litigation going on in forests across western Montana. So a small group of folks got together and thought that maybe forest restoration was a place where there could be a zone of agreement amongst a very diverse group of people. So they convened about 30 of us. It was an invited group that was asked to get together to see if we felt like this is something that would work to get projects happening on the ground. So these 30 folks, kind of talking about who was at the table, represented timber, both mills and loggers, on-the-ground loggers, conservation interests, restoration practitioners, motorized recreation, outfitters and guides, the Forest Service, the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. We had someone representing the governor's office and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So all those different groups were at the table. And we ended up spending about 6 months compiling a set of 13 restoration principles. There were some copies outside if you want to take a look at them. But we all recognize that just putting together a set of 13 restoration principles was not our ultimate goal for this effort. We wanted to implement projects on the ground, we started with 2 national forests, and I wanted to spend a minute talking about the structure of the MFRC because I think it is a little bit unique. So we had this original group of about 30 folks who drafted the principles. And then we started working with the Bitterroot and Lolo National Forests. And for those of you who aren't from here, the national forest that's around us here in Missoula is the Lolo National Forest, the Bitterroot being south of us. And so we set up forest-level restoration committees. And many of the folks on those committees were not a part of the original group of 30 that drafted the principles. So there was a little bit of a leap of faith there to say, yes, we are willing to use the principles that you all came up with to try to get some projects happening on the ground. So we have a Lolo Restoration Committee, a Bitterroot Restoration Committee, and we now have a committee on the Lincoln District of the Helena National Forest. And the role of the Forest Service, I mean, it's been key throughout this whole process. The Forest Service are members of the Montana Forest Restoration Committee, and they act as advisors to the forest level committees and attend every meeting. They are very active participants within the meetings, kind of helping us get through the process. Our objectives for this effort, I think kind of an initial big picture one was to actually build a common understanding of what we all meant by restoration amongst the different interests involved and also with the Forest Service, with the agency. And then from there, to work with the Forest Service to actually plan and implement restoration projects using the principles as our guideline and meeting ecological, social, and economic objectives that we felt were kind of laid out in the principles. Another objective was to get projects happening quicker than traditionally they had occurred. Like I said, to start sort of building this agreement amongst a diverse group and building agreement with the Forest Service, and then kind of pushing that zone of agreement. And we've actually started working on a 14th principle right now, probably a conversation that we could not have had 3 years ago when we started. So as I said before, we are working through kind of the traditional Forest Service process. We actually don't even have an MOU with the Forest Service, although we are thinking about it. As Karen mentioned, I do staff the effort half-time. We have a cost-share agreement between Region 1 of the Forest Service and Montana DNRC. So I'm contracting with the DNRC to work for this effort. So successes and challenges of working through traditional Forest Service process. I do think that we have done a pretty good job of building this common understanding of what we all mean by restoration. I mean, I think it's still playing out on the ground, which is where it really happens. You can talk about principles and talk about it in a meeting room, but getting out on the ground, there's still some challenges there, but I think we're doing a pretty good job. I think we've built a lot of agreement, and as I mentioned, started to expand the agreement. And I think the Forest Service is starting to prioritize our efforts and recognizing that this collaborative can help them get projects happening on the ground. And we actually just found out at our last full group meeting that the Lolo National Forest has full funding for our 2 initial projects that are going to hit the ground this year. So all the road work that we were worried about not getting implemented, weed work, things like that, apparently they have full funding for those. So that was very exciting for us. Appeals and litigation have gone down in the places that we are working. I'm kind of moving to challenges now, but we have not had a project hit the ground yet. So the timeliness factor is still there. We've been engaged in projects for almost 3 years now, and our first 2 are going to hopefully hit the ground this year, but it's definitely a continuing issue for us. And for a while, we had a subcommittee that was looking at the NEPA process, and we kind of realized that was a conversation, I think, at a more national scale, and one that I'm glad we're going to be talking about this afternoon, actually. Let's see. So, I think another challenge, I mentioned that I think there's been some good building of agreement amongst all of us and with the agency. I think we're still working a little bit on the trust issue, and I think having a project hit the ground, having the collaborative work through implementation, contracting, and monitoring will hopefully help with that. But I think it's something that we're still, maybe we're not 100% there yet. I think the agreement's there, the friendships are being built, but I think the trust piece might take us a little bit longer. And the effort definitely needs to, and my husband, Mark, actually added a piece to that. He said it also goes the other way. I think something that came up in one of our groups yesterday, I think the Forest Service, it's hard for them to sort of give up control to a collaborative group. And so I think, it's taking a while for them to have trust in us that we can go out and look at a project area and give them some input that would be useful to them having it happen on the ground. So that goes both ways. Our group, as I said, we still need to follow through on implementation. We haven't gotten there yet, so we're not quite sure what all the challenges will be. We've initiated some pre-project monitoring, but that's kind of the next step for us. And then, another piece that comes up a lot is just long-term funding for this collaborative effort. And we're actually starting a process of some strategic planning, some visioning for the future of the effort, kind of looking back on the first 3 years and thinking about where we want it to go in the future, and funding is a big piece of that. And I just want to wrap up with maybe kind of some bigger picture systemic change issues like that Melanie has brought up before. No, it's good, Melanie. And to me, and I think those 3 questions this morning, I think, really hit on these, and I'm so glad we're going to be addressing those, because I think there are some pieces that a group of people like us, representing a lot of different regional places and different attempts to do this effort can work on, and it's really quick. So changes to the Forest Service budget structure and performance measures for the agency, I think, are 2 really big pieces. And then I think this concept of wanting certainty is a challenging one, and Rick actually referred to it as probably a bit of a myth, but I think we can strive for consistency and sustainability with these efforts. So, thank you. Okay, Rick.
Well, good morning. I am Rick Brown. I'm a senior resource specialist with Defenders of Wildlife in Portland. I think rapidly transitioning into the realm of decrepit resource specialist. I've, since my never finished master's degree work some 35 years ago, I've been involved with national forest management one way or another for ever since. Currently, I'm a member of the Lakeview Stewardship Collaborative in South Central Oregon, the Harney County Restoration Collaborative in Eastern Oregon, and I was kind of there before the beginning for both of those collaboratives and also the Blue Mountain Forest Partners. The Lakeview Collaborative's been in existence for something like 12 years. So I'm talking today about the Oregon Eastside Forest Restoration, Old Growth Protection, and Jobs Act. I challenge anybody to make up a nice acronym from that. S2895 is introduced December of last year. The place covered by that bill comprises something like 8.3 million acres scattered across, depending on how you count, 7 or 6 national forests in eastern Oregon. There are 7 proclaimed forests, and 2 of them are managed jointly, so we typically talk about it as 6 forests. The effort that went into the development of that legislation was not what I would characterize as collaborative, though it was certainly informed by the presence of several collaboratives in eastern Oregon and the participation in some of those collaboratives by some of those of us that helped develop the bill. A couple of other things that help give some context to the development of the bill are what are called the East Side screens, that are regionally imposed forest plan amendments to all the forest plans in eastern Oregon and Washington. Most well-known and notable element of those screens is a limitation on the cutting of trees, live trees over 21 inches, with some exceptions. And also the guidelines for aquatic and riparian protection, referred to as packfish and infish. Both the screens and packfish and infish were developed 15 years or more ago, with the understanding at the time that they were interim direction that would last about 18 months. Another part of the context was that Senator Wyden in Oregon had introduced legislation not introduced, but released final draft legislation that would have covered all national forests in Oregon, both east side and west side, with the nominal goal of protecting old-growth forests and raising timber supply. So in late 2008, we had Wyden's bill, which, as best I can tell, no one but maybe Wyden and his staff liked. The timber industry was feeling the pinch of the recession and feeling pretty desperately in need of a reliable, affordable supply of timber. Conservationists, at least some of us were chafing at the slow pace of restoration, anticipating that we might well lose the Eastside screens, the packfish infish guidelines as the forest plan revision process moved along, and the question of whether Wyden would choose to actually move forward with his very unappealing bill. At that point, someone in the timber industry who, through the Lakeview Collaborative process, had gotten to know a prominent member of the Oregon Forest Conservation community, suggested that that individual talk with a prominent member of the timber industry in Eastern Oregon, which he did. It was quite tentative initially, but they reached the point where they thought there was some utility in having some discussion. They each chose 6 others from their side, and that's how I got to be one member from the conservation side of what became eventually known as the 7x7 talks. We started with a statewide focus, much as Wyden's original bill, but it very quickly became apparent that we couldn't even talk constructively about the west side, about the lands covered by the Northwest Forest Plan, which to some extent slops over the east side of the Cascades. But we stuck with it and decided that maybe there was some opportunity for a discussion about the east side. And there seemed to be 2 main sets of issues that converged, overlapped for mutual benefit. And those revolved around the level and certainty of supply of timber for the industry, and then a set relating to our conservation desire for a clear mandate for restoration and conservation, for finding a way to maintain the principles of the east side screens, packfish and infish, through the forest planning process. And essentially, we pursued legislation because, rather than not, because we perceived it as having the best prospects for an enduring solution, that it would provide adequate certainty for all the participants and would have the greatest likelihood for leading to increased funding levels. The Forest Service was not involved in our discussions, maybe peripherally by Senator Wyden's staff asking some technical questions along the process, but now that the bill's introduced, the Forest Service is much more engaged. The goal is to provide for science-based ecological restoration of forests and watersheds in eastern Oregon, while maintaining the industrial infrastructure, the knowledge, the skills necessary to continue to accomplish restoration, along with the associated social and economic benefits that can provide. The bill is intended to accomplish this with clear direction for a focus on conservation and restoration, while supplying, as a byproduct of ecologically based restoration, timber supply adequate to maintain industry infrastructure. The 21-inch cutting limit is maintained with both ecological and administrative exceptions, as are the standards of packfish and infish as a floor. The agency is certainly free to develop more protective guidance, but they cannot weaken those of the existing pack fish and infish. Temporary roads are permitted, but they need to be promptly decommissioned once the project is completed. There are to be no new permanent roads, or that's wrong. Permanent roads are strongly discouraged, and there's to be an overall net decrease in the road system. One very key element is the establishment of scientific and technical advisory panel that's to provide recommendations generally at the level of plant association groups 6 months after that panel is formed. And that panel would also report to Congress at the 5-year point on how successful we all have been at implementing the legislation. Local collaborative groups, including multi-party monitoring, are strongly encouraged, as is planning at the landscape scale, which is defined as 25,000 acres and up. No real upper limit, maybe 1 million acres or something. The bill promotes the use of stewardship contracts and the utilization of biomass. The administrative appeals process would be replaced by an objections process modeled on, but we think improved from the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. There's an initial 3-year period while sort of awaiting the development of a east side wide assessment where there would be no appeals or objections. The only real avenue of challenge would be to go directly to court. And during that same period, there are acreage targets to be accomplished, averaging about 100,000 acres a year. That ramps up from 80 to 120. Those targets are softened, I think, significantly by the inclusion of language saying, to the extent practicable, those targets should be met. There is a provision, there's authorization for increased funding in the bill, and I think in the minds of those of us who helped develop it, the practicability of reaching those levels, at least the higher parts of them at year 2 and 3, is going to be dependent on increased funding. If that doesn't happen, it's not going to be practicable, and the agency has a good reason not to do it. The bill does not settle roadless issues or deal with issues around post-fire salvage. It really doesn't have much of anything to say about climate change, all of which were sort of disappointing to many of us. It also doesn't do anything to change NEPA or environmental laws. And I guess the final thing I'll say at close is that it seems to me that this bill demonstrates that there's not necessarily a dichotomy between a legislative approach and on one hand and on the other administratively based collaborative approach. I wouldn't support this bill if I didn't think that it was at least neutral, and I actually think it will enhance a collaborative process in Eastern Oregon. Thanks.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about the Lakeview Stewardship Group and how it started and where it's gone and where we hope it will be going. It started, the collaborative in Lake County started after 1996 when the 4th mill out of 5 closed in Lake County. And the only remaining mill was the Collins Company's mill, and they're Forest Stewardship Council certified. So Jane O'Keefe, a county commissioner, and Paul Harlan with the company thought we should have a forum to see how we could reauthorize that unit, because I need to back up. It's a sustained yield unit. And I don't think that's important to, the process is the same whether it is or not. But that's our landscape. It's a 500,000 acre sustained yield unit that was created in 1950. And I think around the country there was 8 or 9 of those created, and there may be 2 of us left. But anyway, with 1 mill left, there was no competition for the material within the unit, so that automatically brought about a review of that unit. Now that's the Clinton era. We're in the middle of the timber wars, and the sustained yield unit was not going to be endorsed by any environmental group out there. And then Jane and Paul got the idea, well, let's have a meeting and we'll talk to Sustainable Northwest, have them come in and help us out and facilitate that. We'll certify the unit. What a logical choice, go, got a certified timber company, certify us. Well, boy, that wasn't going to go either. But what it did was it brought everybody to the table, I think, because when they seen that we were going down that path, and that's not a path that most people wanted us to go down, that we should look at that. And they did. So in 1998, they convened the first meeting and brought groups from all national environmental groups, regional, the timber industry. We had loggers there, 70-some members. I think showed up, 75 or about like that, showed up and started working. And that was the beginning of the stewardship group. And I always think I need to put a warning with collaboration, because my wife was a founding member and still on that collaborative. And collaboratives can go, you just need to know there can be other outcomes of collaboratives, such as marriage and stuff. So just be warned, there should be a warning label on these collaboratives. But anyway. So like I said, they formed in 1998, and in 2001, Chief Dombeck approved the reauthorization of the unit with environmental groups and industry going to D.C. to meet with him, encourage that reauthorization. Well, if you add up, they're looked at every 10 years. We're at our 10-year look to look at that. So next year, we have to go through the process again. So it's been 10 years that we've been on that. The collaborative is now 12 years old. After the unit was signed off and reauthorized, and new goals are both ecological and economic and the like, they're balanced now. It's just not a sustained yield to supply a mill. It's ecological restoration, and then the byproducts will help the mill out. But we've got those common goals that we all agree on in there. And after we finished that and got it signed, we said, what's the next step? That should be just the beginning. And I want to say too, the stewardship group is a non-entity. Lakeview Stewardship Group is not a nonprofit, no legal binding, anything. They're just a collaborative that comes together to work. After the signing of in 2001 by the chief, they said, you need a local group, a local nonprofit to carry that on. And we'd like you to create that nonprofit here locally. And the first thing we did, that's when I was brought in, was we looked and we said, well, we'll look at the membership of the stewardship group to make up that board. And they said, no, we think it should be a local group, not broad spread across, national environmental groups, et cetera, just a local group. So it wound up about 60% of the board was local stewardship group members, and still is today. But we are a local group that carries on and sort of serves as staff to the stewardship group. So, we get out their minutes, we get out the agendas for meetings. They meet quarterly. Usually that's 2 times during the winter when we can't get to the field, and then the summer times it's a summer event where we can go out and look at treatments and stuff. But the next move they made was to say, we need to develop a strategy for that 500,000 acres. What do we want to accomplish on that? And we went through that process. And Rick here was one of the members. I was one. Mike Anderson was the subgroup chairman from the Wilderness Society, and went through that process. And we call it a strategy because only the Forest Service has authority to do forest plans. But it's pretty close to that. So we outlined all the things we agreed on and the type of treatments and where the priority areas were, what treatments needed to be, how heavy they needed to be. I think it was a shock when we're in the field one day and the Forest Service is tiptoeing along with this, doing thinnings and not quite doing enough to really affect fire, ladder fuels and all that. And Andy Kerr just stood there and goes, you guys just ain't thin and heavy enough. And now that brought a new reality to the Forest Service. Not thin. Here we're standing there saying that. And I think it's evolved too that it's important that that's also a climate change strategy for our East Side forest. So we developed that strategy and published it in 2005. We just revised it again for 2010 for the CFLRA. So it's actually the Stewards Group's strategy that is the landscape plan for the CFLRA proposal that we just submitted. And that submittal, I would like to say, we're kind of proud. We were ranked as the #1 priority for Region 6. And I think it was that collaborative. And I want to say another thing. As we were going into this, we said, well, Forest Service, you need to really review this strategy and make sure that we're accurate. And I love one of the Forest Service people said, no, I don't think we need to do that. We need to keep the fingerprints of the Forest Service off of this, minimally as possible. It is your strategy, and we're going to follow it. In those times, as we're developing this and going on, we came to an agreement. We're not going to chase salvage anymore. No more fire salvage. I think that's critical that everybody knows that. We had a zero green program. Our mill was looking like it was going to have to be closed because we couldn't get anything to it. There's no green sales going on. Since we've done that, they have reached the 30 million board feet mark with retained receipts and a 10-year stewardship contract. So now we have in place, we have a 20-year MOU on supply with the agencies and the local units of government and the nonprofit. We have a 10-year stewardship contract that Collins has. We have Collins, based on that, put in a $6.8 million new small diameter log that'll take down to a 7-inch top, because that's what we're going to be taking out of this forest. And I also want to say, when I testified on the bill Rick just talked about before Senator Wyden's committee, I said I didn't really know if I wanted to be there, and I really didn't. When they asked me to testify, I go, why? We're doing most things as the bill says. You know, why do we want to step up and maybe become a target? I like being under the radar screen and just getting things done, you know. But I have a greater fear, and that's the unit needs to reach about 10,000 acres a year of treatments, or we're going to lose our big old pines and stuff. And we can't just sit alone. I not only, love the place I live and the pines there. I think all Eastern Oregon, I think, in fact, all the east side dry states, dry ponderosa pine type habitats are all in the same condition, declining rapidly. Our old growth trees through our monitoring program are dying 100 to 200 years prematurely in many stands, not all. And if we don't reach those, our legacy is going to be that we drove them out, and it'll just be smaller trees. That's my fear. And it's a greater fear than being a public target and maybe attracting lawsuits. And I want to say the collaborative has worked great because we have not had a lawsuit since 2002. Now, we have had a couple threatened ones, but usually Rick Brown, Mike Anderson, one of the collaborative members in the conservation group will go talk to their fellow conservation groups and say, you know, we've actually helped design that sale or that unit, and we're behind what's there. And I think that's important too in collaboration. It's no longer the Forest Service coming in saying we have, 3 alternatives or 2 alternatives, and this is the preferred one. Now what do you think? That's not collaboration. One of the things as you get older, I had a health problem, and I don't have saliva like most people, so I run out of the juices to talk, which is probably good for most of you. So anyway, they forgot even where I was on that one. But the collaborative, is now, rather than that scenario, they are in the design. The Forest Service looks at our goals. When we first reauthorized the units, they did not look at the goals and put it out as part of the strategy, and how did that project affect those goals. Now they do. They look at everything in the strategy and relate it to it. They come to the stewardship group and ask them to help design that. What do you want to see? And we go to the field, we monitor it, and we got a great monitoring program, I should tell you. I'm just going to finish with this. With that, the group, the first thing they wanted was a monitoring program, and we established that. And we've had kids with us now that have gone through high school to get their PhDs with us. And it's great. This past summer, one of them earned $40,000 in winning an international science contest with the data off that monitoring. So other side benefits that are just fabulous. I love paying those paychecks too to those kids that go into college and stuff. But anyway, the collaborative, I think, works really well. And Paul Harlan, I'll conclude with this, said it best of all in a video that we did. And he said, you know, when somebody, and I'll use Rick as a conservation community person, says when Rick is not there, we do not vote because we can get it through. What we do is ask ourselves, what would Rick think? And I think when you get to that point, you have a true collaborative. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. And now we have time for questions. We are going to take questions until 10 after because we started a little bit late. We'll still have time for a good long break where you can talk to each other. So are there questions out there? Oh, Jonathan.
Oh, not working?
Jim, can you talk a little about the monitoring program briefly? What is your monitoring? How you do it?
Okay. Yeah, okay. The question was, could I talk a little bit more about the monitoring program and how it was established? Okay. And that was the first thing we did as a nonprofit, was go after grants and others to start that monitoring program in 2002, the year LCR was created. It was the first thing we did because that was a priority for the stewardship group. And then we got an ecologist, Richard Hart, who was one of the first scientists to review the unit as we were getting it authorized, so had a history with the Lakeview Stewardship Group. And he designed a protocol out there to go through monitoring and monitor everything the Forest Service was doing. So it doesn't matter if it's aquatic, if it's road decommissioning, if it's thinnings and treatments and what was occurring. Are in the where we get the old growth report, what's happening to our old growth, about them dying prematurely. Our transects that we have out there, we've got thousands of plots now over 7 years. And a lot of data. And we've really grown with that. It's very, very scientific oriented, and I don't think every forest needs that detail of monitoring. Personal opinion. I won't state that for the stewardship group. Personal opinion. But but I think you need it in every region, at least one, to gather that detailed data that's occurring. And so, if you want answers on what, juniper thinnings are doing and what thinnings on ponderosa pine and the effects on old growth when you take out the small trees and they're not competitive, are they responding? How good is deep subsoiling? It's nothing but a weed bed. You don't do that anymore. And we've proved that. You should never do that. So it's that, and the RAC dollars is what's been paying for it. This is the first year we've not been able to get money, but hopefully through the CFLRA, it's only a 1 year layoff that we don't have the crews. And we'll go back to that because we're getting to the point we can get trends now. After 7 years, we're starting to pick that up. We didn't have that before.
Great. Okay, other questions I see.
Hi, good morning. This is a question for Marnie. Marnie, with our group, there's a big concern about not having any upfront agreement that the products from that group will be used or given any more weight than a single comment from the public. And I'm just curious with MFRC and your restoration committees, how you guys have navigated that, how you've seen projects actually change, and how your recommendations get carried through the NEPA process. And can you intuit what I'm asking?
I can. It rings a bell. Yeah, I mean, I think it is certainly a challenge that we are still working through. And I'll give an example of one that we went through, one of our projects that's going to hit the ground this year, and kind of what happened there. So the Forest Service, when the Lolo Restoration Committee first got started, I actually chaired that committee, and we were presented with a couple of projects from the Forest Service, and one of them had already started the scoping process. And one of our goals was to start working with the Forest Service before scoping, so pre-NEPA, but I actually kind of pushed us to take it on because it was a little bit bigger project with a lot of components, and I sort of wanted to push the group a little bit. So the Forest Service came out with a preferred alternative, and our group did not agree with their preferred alternative and sort of drafted our own. And, in the end, the Forest Service actually chose our alternative over their original preferred alternative. And I think, it was partly because we are a collaborative effort, and they felt like, there was a lot of public input to our effort. But we also worked with some other publics. So we did some outreach to local landowners, and they also supported our effort. So I think between those two pieces, the Forest Service saw that our alternative probably would make the most sense in the long run. So that's one example of how we've been, but it's a continuing challenge.
Great. I see Janine and then Melanie.
I have a question for Rick pertaining to the, sorry about the sound, the appeals process being eliminated and replaced with objections. And if you could just amplify the objections process a little, because I'm not that familiar with HFRA. And secondarily, sort of related, how is it that NEPA is not affected if the appeals process is eliminated?
I guess the last question first is that appeals aren't part of NEPA. They're part of the agency's administrative procedures. Still not. The Appeals Reform Act is not NEPA either. The objections process is pre-decisional rather than post-decisional, so that the agency would identify the preferred alternative, the proposed action, and then anyone who has concerns can object, and that leads to kind of a negotiation process to work out differences before the decision is made. I'm not going to remember them all. The changes in the bill to that relate to having the agency identify the preferred alternative in advance. That's sort of irrelevant under the HFRA because there's only one alternative under that act. But if there are multiple alternatives, which is anticipated in this bill, the agency has to identify the proposed so that you know what you're objecting to. Also tried to tighten up the timelines and impose an obligation on the Forest Service to respond to objections in a timely fashion. Currently, they have the ability to sort of just sit on them and never respond and never resolve the differences. So that's the main elements of it.
Okay. Yeah. My question is also for Rick. Can you explain the additional funding that would come as a result of the Wyden bill, how that funding is, so what it's for, if it's truly additional in your opinion or in your, knowledge, and also where that funding might actually be coming from if you have any idea where they're going to get it. I'm just trying to track what this additional funding piece, what it's going for and where it's coming from.
It's a good question. My understanding, and I've not had direct discussions with Wyden or his staff about this, but what gets relayed secondhand is that it would not be a reallocation from other regions, other areas in the Forest Service. It would be additional money that Senator Wyden would get. And maybe to oversimplify, but the notion that each senator has a certain amount of money they can direct to activities in their state, and the commitment from Senator Wyden is that he's going to direct the money that he has influence on for Oregon into this bill and not distribute it across multiple projects and activities in the state, and that money would then go to implementation of the bill.
But what implementation? What did you want the money to be able to do?
The question is, what would that money do? It would help accomplish restoration projects. So it's available for all the elements of the bill, for planning, for implementation, for monitoring. Yeah, it's money to the Forest Service without particular restrictions like you see in some others, like the stewardship contracting.
Okay, I see a question back here, and then we'll go over here to Liz.
Just a quick Oregon question. I'm not sure if this is even. What other than the appeals process changes would have required legislation. That is to say, what in the bill could not have been done purely administratively?
I don't know if I've entirely thought that through, but for instance, it would be hard to establish the scientific and advisory panel without at least an earmarked appropriation to make that happen. I'll confess that I came into it. I'm on record 8 years ago testifying before Senator Wyden, excuse me, telling him that we didn't need any additional authorizing legislation from Congress. We needed, at that time, oversight and additional funding. And there were times during this whole negotiation where I kind of sat back and said, do we really need this? But when I read through the entire package as a package in all its elements, it really hangs together for me, and I saw it as an opportunity to advance. But you're right. You could, in theory, do a lot of this with just increased appropriations. There's not a lot of additional authority, but it's packaging it all together and giving that impetus to action that we think legislation could accomplish, that kind of piecemeal appropriations and hand-waving and general admonitions wouldn't.
Okay, we're going to, Liz, you had your hand up?
You have to speak loud.
I'm really good at that, actually. Marnie, you had mentioned that your group is looking for long-term funding and that you will be implementing some projects, and I think this might be an important point for other collaboratives. From my experience in the project that we completed, stewardship contract, which is now years over, we were able to very creatively market the timber products. At the time, we had the infrastructure and the mills around to do that. Is that an option for you folks or for others? Have you looked into that? That is the surplus of our long-term funding. We've had a little bit of grant funding, but we're still living off of that. So it might.
So could everybody hear her question?
Ooh, repeat the essence. Talking about long-term funding and thinking about different markets for wood products, small diameter wood products, and have we looked at that for sort of long-term funding? You know, I think within our MFRC effort, not so much yet, because we kind of haven't had that conversation yet. Where it has come up is sort of a subset of the MFRC, and then some other folks submitted a CFLRA proposal where we gave that a lot of consideration. I mean, Western Montana has lost a lot of infrastructure, but still has a fair bit. So we looked at ways to kind of boost that, help the existing businesses, and think about other businesses that might fit in. So I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Well, we are at 10 after. Are we at 10 after? No, we're not. I can't read my watch. Okay, so Mike Peterson had a question.
Yeah.
Talk
I
loud
can
and then
talk
we'll
loud.
repeat it.
Rick, it seemed like you were saying that there would be a 3-year period where you would have a target of 300,000 acres total, and that would be before this science panel. And so I guess my question is, has the group identified where those 300,000 acres are? It seems like that's close to 5% of the total forest, which is, you know, pretty significant. Have you identified those, and who would be, it'd be the Forest Service, assuming they got the money that would do the NEPA on those? Is that possible to even do that in 3 years?
Good question.
Can you repeat the essence of
The question is whether this interim 3-year target, which goes from 80 to 120,000 acres, do we know where those are going to be, and is it even achievable? My sense is that if I look at what's happening on the Malheur Forest and the Fremont Wainema and the collaboratives that I'm involved in, they're very close to that 80,000 acre figure total within a year or so anyways in planning. And no, we don't know exactly where they'll be located. They'll be identified through NEPA, through the collaborative processes. There are various estimates, but You know, the Nature Conservancy has some estimates in Oregon. It's including the east slope Cascades portion of the Northwest Forest Plan that this bill doesn't, into many millions of acres, 13 million or something. I think that's sky high. I think there are several million acres in need of restoration. Say it's 3 million at 100,000 acres a year, that's 30 years worth of work. It doesn't seem to me to be an exceptionally high pace.
Okay, there's a question over here in the back.
You've been talking a lot about restoration in context of collaboratives. I want to explore this a little bit further. Restoration and that concept implies that sometime forests are going to be restored. I want each of you to sort of answer what happens to your collaborative once a forest is restored, and when do you think that will be?
Would you like to start, Bernie?
Well, you know, I think that collaboration, I mean, one of the goals, I think, of collaboration is just relationship building. And, you know, I don't necessarily think the MFRC is going to be around forever. Whether or not we feel like restoration has happened and we're done with it, you know, it could morph into something else. Gosh, when do you know it's done? I mean, you know, I think it depends on the place a little bit. You know, restoration in some places could lead into sustainable forestry practices. In some places, it could lead into, you know, no forest management, letting, you know, fires burn and those types of things happen. So, you know, I think it's going to be dependent on the piece of land that you're talking about. And, you know, I think that is a conversation that we have not had as a collaborative, is sort of what happens to these lands after restoration. We right now are focused on restoration because that's where we found this zone of agreement. So those next steps, we just haven't gotten there yet.
That's true. I've thought about it. I think the restoration would be long after I left this earth and not to see it. But some of the new bills and some of the ability of timber to pay for the extra work through retained receipts, I hope I get to see the beginning, and our monitoring will show that we're headed in that direction before I do leave this earth. So I think it's very long term, and we haven't got that far yet in our discussions either.
I think if nothing else, climate change ensures that we're not going to find a restoration endpoint. I'm not sure there really is one anyways. But some level of a high degree of approximation of what we're talking about is going to take decades, probably 3 at an absolute minimum. For me, collaboration it's a tool more than it is an objective per se. So if we reach a point where collaboratives aren't particularly relevant, so be it. And I don't expect to be around when that time comes anyway. So I think, you know, there's an old saying of, you want to make God laugh, make a plan. And I think we obsess a bit about planning for the long term. I think that was always kind of an illusion. Climate change makes it even more so.
Okay. We have so many questions. Is it Kristen? Jessica, I'm sorry.
I can yell pretty loudly. Marnie, a related question for you. In Colorado regarding lodgepole pines, this question about restoration is a big one. We're trying to sort out what we mean by it and whether it's relevant in lodgepole pine. But I'm observing a lot of lodgepole pine around here, so I was wondering what was the process to define restoration, and what did you wind up coming up with?
Well, that's a great question, because our Principle 14 that we're working on has to do with mixed severity, mixed conifer forests. So, because yes, there are a lot of lodgepole mixed severity forests, and when we first put the principles together, they're fairly broad. And, as I said when I was talking, I mean, when you get out on the ground, there's still a lot of wiggle room in those principles. And I think that's where the individual forest collaboratives have to come to some agreement. But, just particularly thinking about restoration and mixed conifer forests, it is more challenging. How do you deal with lodgepole forests that naturally have a shorter life cycle, and at the end of that, they either die with fire or disease, and that's their natural process. One of the things, and this I think is probably different from Colorado, but in western Montana, I think we have more lodgepole forests now than we did historically because of past management practices in part, fire suppression, other issues. And so one of the things we're looking at is diversity within the forest, and how can we restore processes and diversity in some of those forests. So that's the tack that we're taking to look at it. But I agree, it's much more complex than looking at, say, a ponderosa pine forest. So.
Okay, Nick had a question up here, Kasha. And then I'm sorry, we have to cut off the discussion, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the small groups to continue.
So this is, I'm Nick Goulet with the Watershed Research and Training Center in Hayfork, California. It's a question for Rick. It's about the two provisions in the act that really get at changing how business is done, sort of deal with the science panel and the modified objections process. Do the people on the sort of committee that put this together believe that those are otherwise useful changes across the national forest system that would be helpful? And is there a reason that the committee that had a hearing actually bring that up and talk about, are these systemic changes that we really need to see across the national forest system?
I'm reluctant to suggest that the changes in the appeal process ought to be system-wide. I think in some ways, if this bill were come to pass, it could be kind of a pilot project to see how that works. In terms of establishing a more sound scientific basis for management through something like this science panel, I think that would be a good idea wherever we could make it happen.
Okay, well, let's thank our panelists, and thanks to all of you for your good questions.